Dylan Foley, how are you?
Not too bad. And yourself?
Good. Not so bad either, I guess. I'm in Dublin. I'm in my sister's car outside my sister's house in South Dublin. It's a bit
Studio.
overcast. This is my studio. I'm using the phone as usual. So we're going to do this podcast, and today's
Have everything.
podcast. Go on.
Have everything up there, don't they?
The state of the art equipment. It's beautiful to look at. Getting there, I think.
That's very good.
But yeah, based here in Dublin at the moment because I'm doing with the Rural Red Residency, which is an art gallery, national, European, renowned, revered. I should have written down a lot of this positive stuff, promotions, get on people's good sides. But anyhow, it's not a promotion, but as such. But it's a good place, it's great people. And in there, I'm doing an arts residency on building, creating, shaping, and designing part of TraVision Foundation, which in itself is a kind of a unique platform. It comes from our own community, our own culture, which was a very much old Irish culture, Gaelic culture. So we're trying to create and shape a system into today's world out of that mentality and see how it'll all play out. In other words, it'll be a very decentralized organization. Hopefully, in theory, it should be. And that brings us on to this conversation we're going to have today. It's about decentralization. It's almost about Bitcoin and cyber currencies, and particularly on blockchains. So Dylan is the highly renowned expert in the west of Ireland on all of this stuff, just in case you need more information afterwards. Dylan Foley, tell me, what is a blockchain and why are we even talking about it?
Well, I suppose we're talking about it. Well, firstly, it's in the news. I think it's in the news, isn't it, now that we have a couple of words to deal with, don't we? What do you call it? Metaverse. Now that Facebook has decided it's not Facebook anymore, but it's now called Meta, and that's a word that comes from the blockchains, which is technology. So we're all hearing about Bitcoin and
yeah.
And I suppose the reason, like what your introduction says, I suppose the reason is that we're trying to say that there's nothing new under the sun, isn't that right? In a sense,
yeah.
The technology is new. The technology is new, but the ideas behind it, or the way things are organized, it doesn't always have to be. That we can look at we might have a little bit of a chat about the past as well, in the sense that Ireland. It's interesting because Ireland was also. Let's jumping back into the past for 1 second.
No, do, because that is what TraVision is: past, present, and future. Go for it.
Just to say that, like Ireland's history, for most of Ireland's history, it ran its political situation and organization in the Gaelic world, which was for thousands of years until about the 17th century, was, as you said, was decentralized kind of authorities, So no one place was in charge of the country. There was no, even though we had kings didn't run the entire show. Everything, in fact, it was divided into different numbers of tuas, as we know. Well, 4 provinces, actually 5 provinces originally. The 5/5, and then within them, various clans and tuas divided into the countries or territories that were organized into confederations, as they call them, or whatever. But no, and you can talk about this in the present moment as well, but like there was no, even to be a high king of Ireland, you kind of it didn't mean you had direct authority across the whole country. Now they had authority of sorts, but it was they couldn't change the laws within individual tuas that weren't their own ones, for instance.
Yeah, you're always going to have, if it's almost a partnership, an alliance within any kind of setting. It's like if it's good for us all, we should stand together. If it's going to affect us all, we should stand together. So that kind of monopoly kind of discussions will go on, I'd imagine.
Yeah, so like we had 4 main provinces in Meath, which means the middle or the center, and in Meath you had the kind of like the new function seemingly kind of like the neutral zone, in which big gatherings were held, Tara and Tulsh and the big festivals where people were on sort of neutral ground. So it kind of functioned as a ground that was neither of the 4 main provinces, and therefore you weren't in anyone else's territory, if you know what I mean.
But in other words, that would be a kind of a location of decentralization. In other words, no matter who you are, who you think you are, how powerful you are, you go into this zone, you're just like everybody else. You don't dictate to anyone. You can't control it. Is that
Yeah,
it?
yeah, it seems to be like that. So it's kind of the opposite to say the European systems at the time and now that we're used to, where you have a capital city at the middle or the main center, and the king is there or the government, and everything is centralized there. So we have that now. We have one of the most centralized countries in Europe because everything is centered on Dublin, as you know, because of historical reasons. So, but Ireland was actually the opposite to that. Outside of Dublin. Dublin was centralized in those days too, of course. Dublin was running a centralized system because it was an English system, but it only extended as far as the Pale. So, out as far as the four shires, as we've discussed before.
Mm-hmm.
Outside of that is what we're talking about. It was decentralized, and it's almost the opposite, just like you said. Very interesting in the sense that instead of power and authority being, the king having power and authority in the middle or at the center, instead, if the center is like a place that everyone can gather, because actually your authority, you don't have it there, if you know what I mean. So it's quite different.
Yeah, and that's pretty much, again, almost very similar to the selection of who your leader would be. One family couldn't dictate, this will be our leader. It had to be extended family, had to be a person that was agreed upon many, that this person would be more good for us than bad for us. Or it could be the lesser two evils, who knows? But it was kind of that decentralized that it wasn't a dictation process. It was more like you choose your own leader.
It's things going on in history books that you're discussing there. There's things going on in history books that sort of wouldn't happen or would cause all kinds of problems in a system that was different. So every Tua had its own little army, its own kings, its own little armies, its own little courts, its own little, everything in miniature. And
and that's very much again a bit like even today with Irish travelers. So when people say Irish travelers, they automatically assume one group, one culture, one identity, one people. But in the traveler community, for all that's left of us, there's a very diverse, similar mentalities. In other words, there could be little tweaks and twists and turns with each clan and different clans, culturally wise. They might do one thing slightly different and the others do similar opposite, or that kind of over and back. So it was a very diverse community even now. So what you're saying with the Tuas, one court, one army, one court, it means it could also be functional and slightly different, but still connected.
So there was law like customary Brehon law or whatever that they talk about, but it wasn't just one system. I mean, it had law. There was law issued by the churches, for example, or by big synods or bishops or something. Con law, it kind of might extend across the whole country, but how that was actually implemented would all be down to the local clans or local Tuas, because each one is in charge of its own area. And I think there's anything up to 170 odd of them, 180 different little units in the country that are the sort of that we call countries or territories, if you know what I mean. And each, they're grouped together into groups, but at the same time, those can change. And like I'm saying that you have cases where there's disputes, who's as you were saying about leaders, who's the main leader, but there's Tuas that are, they're in half at one stage because there's actually two leaders,
Yeah.
This kind of thing. But quite often, interestingly enough, happening without wars and stuff.
Well, I go back into that one again, because, and again, I'm only saying this because of what I grew up with, and all of it sounds almost identical to the history you've been telling me anyway. But if I was to think that one out, I would think that you can have a leader, a spokesperson, a chieftain, all of that, but he could have 2 brothers, 3 brothers, 4 brothers, or 5 brothers, and each one of them would be as valued as the king himself. So when you say you could have 2 leaders, you could have 3 or 4 leaders, because there's still one group, you could say.
Oh yeah, there you go. It's interesting. I exactly, because when you're reading it through, so that's the thing, isn't it? When you're reading it through a kind of centralized. Now, this is something that, for example, the system that was in the Pale would be the exact opposite, completely the opposite. Authority runs in a pyramid right to the top, and you basically very limited ability to make your own decisions if you're not at the top, if you know what I mean. You have to clear everything with the center, you know what I mean. And so they're running very much an opposite system, but one that we're more familiar with now, where authority runs in a big pyramid all the way from, you know, the ordinary man in the street all the way up to this authority that's down in Dublin, and that's where it is, and that's how it works. Right back to the castle.
Yeah, it's a very European Western structure. And you can see it, whether it's the politics or the religion or even businesses. It's a very pyramid type setup. Someone's always at the very top. Then you got management, middle management, CEOs, and stuff like this, working your way down to the workers.
Yeah,
so that's their systematic mentality, I'd imagine.
Well, that was it. That was based on the feudal system in Europe, which people were familiar with. You know, the kind of, and they'd literally drawn it like a kind of pyramid where God was at the top, according to them. Of course, God was conveniently missing in the sense that really it was the king, you know, or the Pope in the medieval world.
That's right.
You know, but then the kings, and then from a pyramid, everything is held from the king, you know. So the king's authority is God has appointed him as an individual, and or the queen, and everything after that, everything, all the land, everything is held by the grace of the king or the grace of God, essentially. You know what I mean? So it all goes down in a big pyramid, right down to the bottom, down to the, you know. And
there's very little difference between when you take even the Catholic Church, for example. You got the hierarchy, you got the Pope at the very top. Yeah. Then you've got these bishops, and then you've got priests, then you got trainees. Well, if you can go to the president, politicians, political parties, voters, and so on, it's almost identical no matter which way you look at it. Same with a company, the head of the company, then the management, as I mentioned. But yeah, I just can't get it out of my head. It's so almost predictable to look at it, how it was designed, where it might have come from.
Yeah. So what's interesting in Ireland is that you have decentralized authority, but you also have a system of law that's across the whole country, the Brehon law, you know. So like I said, it might be implemented slightly differently in different places, but at the same time, it's that's universal. So there's like a universal code that ties together Gaelic civilization, but there's also, you know, customs and how things are done. But at the same time, actual authority, like what we would call political authority, is spread across the country. And it had its, I mean, each systems have their advantages and disadvantages. You know yourself, the very centralized system has certain disadvantages as well as advantages. And one of, you know, so they were good at, you know, they could, you know, like the capitalist systems of putting the resources into the field, and, you know, leaving aside how wrong or right it is, if you know what I mean. In the great struggle that took place in the 16th century in Ireland and 17th century, is really a struggle between those type systems. You could look at it that way, you know. Well,
you could say systems. You could also say the battle of the mentalities.
Absolutely,
they're definitely two different mentalities. Just before we go into the present, why we're kind of touching on the history, because I mentioned TraVision has that a cultural perspective on Irish history and the world view and so on and so forth. So we consider ourselves outside of the European / Western mentality because we didn't come from there. And this goes back in what Dilean was just talking about. All Irish Gaelic culture was the opposite of the European culture. Now, before I bring it in, because when I'm learning more about the blockchain and the security and the all that goes with that, it's almost identical what we've been planning and talking about, even with TraVision, how to shape it and how to create it. It's going to be a decentralized organization, no dictatorship. Now, what popped into my head there a minute ago, we were talking about a long-coded Celtic culture, is that the posts themselves rhymed off whatever message or whatever code they were doing, and it could not be a letter or a word out of place, or else it would collapse. In other words, it wasn't the original. It doesn't sound right.
Yeah.
So I was just thinking about we'll go on to the right now and I'll hand over to you, is the modern day version. Now we're jumping into the future, right? We're talking Metaverse, this artificial world that people's psychology will now be resting within. A bit like that movie, The Guy. I don't know if people have seen that, or The Truman Show, another way of looking at it. But I would link the post coding to hash coding or signature coding, blockchain coding.
Yeah,
it's almost similar.
That's a very interesting idea. Yeah, it's very interesting because So you have the Irish poetry, especially Don Giroch, as they call it, which means direct or straight up. How would you put it? Righteous or straight or correct or truthful. I don't know. There's a few meanings for the word Giroch, but
we used to say it straight to your mouth.
Yeah. So it means literally straight. Okay.
Yeah.
Giroch in Irish. So
Spell
Don
it out
Giroch
kind
is
of thing.
straight out poetry, kind of. We could translate it as for the moment. But that poetry had become very formalized in Ireland, like you're describing. And when you're saying code, you're not even exaggerating in the sense that the types of Don Giroch, you had to spend about 12 years learning how to do it, in the sense it had very specific rhyming cycles in it. You know what I mean? So it was like each in one of them, for example, each line has to end with the first line would end with a word with 2 syllables in it. The second line would be 3 syllables, and that continues all the way through and can't be broken, you know. So and it also has rhyming, a rhyme at the beginning, X rhyming they call it, where the last word of one sentence rhymes with the first word of the second one, and crisscrossing, as they call it. So some of them have those patterns in them, and they go all the way through, and they might be describing like lists of chiefs or historical kings or things like that. And as you said, it was actually a good way of maintaining information from being corrupted, because firstly, there's lots of poets in different parts of the country, and they come together and compare. And secondly, it wasn't easy to alter, because if you altered a poem like that someone had created, that followed those regulations, followed those rules, if you change something, it was immediately obvious, because it would be difficult to change it and have it make sense, but also still rhyme.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Which is quite incredible.
Well, as you said, 12 years, I'd say that's not far off from a high-class, top-class coder in modern terms. Computer coding would take it out almost that length to reach high levels, would it?
Yeah, I would think so. Well, absolutely to be an expert, like that's 12 years is, like you'd be the top. I mean, by that stage, those guys probably didn't even chant their own poems off that much, because they used to sit there and their trainees did it. But yeah, of course, like any profession, take at least 10 years to get very good at anything, really. I mean, to be an expert, to be in most things, I think.
Okay, back into the present for a moment.
So what you're talking about, very similar. So we have a modern thing where firstly the internet itself, was decentralized, is a decentralized protocol.
Like nobody owns the internet kind of thing, is it?
No, exactly. So it was created on purpose, just to go back in very tiny brief thing, in the sense that it was created first in the 60s, was it 60s or 70s, but it was DARPA, the crowd making the robots. Now it was the Defense Advanced Research Project.
That's right. Noam Chomsky worked on the early stages of that,
Oh, did he?
It was funded by the Defense Department.
Yeah, well, actually,
they wanted for scientists to communicate with each other directly.
Yeah. No, that makes total sense. Yeah, that makes total sense. And they had this they funded the original internet. Yeah, you're right. And the original internet just tied the machines together. Now, there wasn't actually a World Wide Web and all that kind of stuff, just that point. But they wanted to create something, like they didn't think, oh, we're going to create a great new world or anything like that. What they thought was, we want something that'll survive a nuclear strike.
Oh, I gotcha.
Yeah. So they had to create. They realized that the only way to do that was to create something that was decentralized, which is quite interesting, actually, because it actually goes again.
It popped into my head there for a moment. At the time, say the little bit I know, when Rome collapsed. The democracy, the literature, the scholars, and it was lost for such a long time. The rest of Europe was in the dark ages without this kind of knowledge, and took them quite a while to come out of it. So I think when the nuclear blast and the internet, it was so people did not become disconnected with each other in the presence of a disaster of some kind or another.
Yeah, well, originally, yeah, exactly. But originally, the military are trying to do it because decentralized system is very hard to break. So like if a nuclear strike hit one city, it would mean that the command and control crowd would still be able to issue orders or information across the net, because it's a network. And it'll just go around it, if you know what I mean. So you could knock out one city, but it didn't matter, because a message would just be routed around it.
They were taking the target off their own back, so to speak. They didn't have one prime location for it to be taken out, as you said, yeah.
Yeah, which is very similar, similar said, was one of the advantages that Ireland had, as we said, it was one of the advantages Gaelic culture had when it came to the struggle. Say like when Dublin extended its when it sent armies beyond the Pale and started into the conquest, it ran into the same problem. You could conquer one Tua or you could take one Tua, but that was just one, and you could take out a leader, but there was many other leaders, as you've just pointed out.
Yeah.
And the Irish system was very good at throwing up leaders that were good leaders, whereas the centralized system was very bad at it. So anyway, we can talk about that later. But to go forward, so they created internet originally for that reason, that it was be decentralized, and then I think about 1989, Tim Berners-Lee fella in Switzerland invented the World Wide Web, the IP protocols on top of it to allow the websites to exist and to be, to sit on top of the internet.
And each website then has their IP address, as so does every internet user, I think. So that's their code to make them unique inside the World
original
Wide Web.
So you remember the 90s, just to go on about it briefly, remember the 90s when it was all idealism again of the internet and the hackers and all this kind of stuff, but the idea was it was decentralized and authority, anyone could create a website and anyone could have a business and all this kind of stuff. That was fine until the 2000s when it got kind of, as we would say, colonized, didn't it, by the big corps, because it was actually quite hard to, you had to be kind of good to put a website together and stuff. Yeah, it took a bit of doing, in fairness, still does actually. And so not everyone could do it. So if you could build a platform or something onto the web that was useful or whatever, then you could get somewhere, couldn't you? And that's what we have with the rise of Facebook and all them kind of ones. So, but one of the problems with that protocol was that it was designed kind of with a great thing in mind, that everyone would be open communications and everything would be lovely. Now the problem is that with everyone signed up to it, of course, everything's getting hacked constantly, isn't it? And it wasn't really built to be that secure. Plus, information can just be changed. You hack in somewhere and change all the bank account numbers or do something like that. There's a problem, isn't there? Because you can't even prove. It's hard to prove what happened, and it's hard to, once a hack is done and everyone's information's out there, it's kind of too hard.
I read in the paper. I seen online that came from a newsagent paper that some guy came back to find out his house had been sold because somebody stole his internet or stole his ID. So imagine that, come back and your house is gone. It was sold in his name and his ID.
I mean, I'm laughing, but it's daft. Yeah. Just
on that, right? The internet was designed with the principle of one, take our target off our back, expand it so it doesn't go down, nobody owns it, and it almost decentralized itself. Say with Bitcoin, that would be the same principle, say like decentralizing the economy in terms of money.
Okay, so like we have Bitcoin and Ethereum and all these kind of things, and everyone knows about, we're listening to a lot of stuff about cryptocurrencies and all this kind of stuff. But just to say that really what's going on is behind the currency is really just another form of the internet. The next form of the internet, they call Web 3 or whatever, right? So Web 2 would be things like Facebook and that. We had the rise of the corps, Google and Facebook and all them, and that kind of domination of the internet. But the internet is still there. It's still open outside of those platforms. You know what I mean? But it's just that they became so enormous that for some people, Facebook is the internet, and that became a problem, as you know, because once they're selling advertising and all that kind of stuff, that high centralization would mean that everything is in the one area, and people, it could have huge, if something goes wrong with the algorithm is, like what happened with the politics in the last while, it was easy to manipulate, shall we say. You could just pay for a lot of advertising, pay for people's information, like what happened with the Cambridge Analytica scandals and that, where they took a lot of people's information and used it to influence the votes and all that kind of stuff. So we had these problems going on. So anyway, in response to that, in 2009, a guy issued the Bitcoin was created as a kind of again, like you said, a protocol or a code that is a thing runs on a thing called a blockchain, which sounds bizarre, but really the blockchain is what's underpinning all of these currencies. Let's just say that.
just briefly explain what I think. I'm trying to think of ways to explain what does a blockchain, what does it look like. And again, it's just one long code. And what reminded me of sometimes when you're on the internet and you're putting up a password, and the internet might suggest a password to you.
Yeah.
So it's got letters, it's got symbols, it's got at, and it's got divides, it's got all these different things going on
Yeah.
inside it.
Yeah.
And you wouldn't remember, and that's a short one. And what they did, I believe, is at the end of that long code they call blockchain, is they put a hash, like the hashtag,
Yes.
which is very similar again with the online hashtagging names. It lights it all up, it brings it all together. It should make sense if you want to be able to read it. Is that my basic understanding so far on the blockchain?
So roughly, just exactly. So this is just a new level of technology. However, it's not mysterious. What it really is a ledger, as they call it. So a ledger is the accounts book that you have to have for a company, which we're talking about just the other day, actually. So you have a ledger where you're entering everything coming in and everything going out on each page.
Yeah.
So the original Bitcoin is literally just an electronic ledger, just lists of, transactions lists, if you know what I mean. And when it reaches a certain number of transactions, it does exactly what you said. You run a cryptographic code on it. You run a mathematical thing on it, basically, to get a hash code like you're talking about, and that's unique to that page. Okay. Yeah. And then you say that's one block, and then you take that hash code and you put it with the next block, if you know what I mean. So that creates the chain. Each block that's made has its hash code, and then you take the hash code and put it on the next block. So they have two overlapping blocks, overlapping codes, if you know what I mean. Now, if you change anything, if you change a hash code, if you change any information on that page, it throws out it means the page and the code don't match, basically. I won't go into it, I'm not going to pretend to understand the maths. However, it's based on the same, what we mean by cryptography, and that is just the same thing as, when you used to do
it goes back to the post, doesn't it?
Yeah,
there's an original code. You'll know it when you're being told.
Yeah, you had to learn it. So exactly. So there was they're just running computer code versions of what the poets were doing, and it's the same crack. It's like when you used to do a code as a kid and you change the letters of a word. You'd have make each letter equal a number, if you know what I mean, and then change it, and you could write, if you knew the code, you could find out what the word really was, that kind of way.
I think mirror coding was as far as I got.
Okay, yeah, well, exactly, but that's all it is. That's all that's happening now. What they call a chain, because they chain the blocks together, and they're just like pages in a book, and they just chain them together on the computer, and then off it goes, if you know what I mean. So as you're transacting things, they chain it together. Now, the next step is the chain is, you're building a chain on one computer. So what happens if you take that chain and give a copy of the same chain to every computer that wants one, or everyone involved in the network? That's your decentralization, if you know what I mean. So you don't just trust one person to have a chain, because I could write in a transaction saying that Dilean has millions of Bitcoins. Do you know what I mean? But if all the other people have copies of the chain as well, like you do, and everyone else has a copy as well, then all those can be checked, right? And all of them say I don't, okay? And therefore,
so if there's any subtle little changes, say from I'm going to go back next month or back 3 months in my ledgers or blocks, and I want to change something because I'm not happy with it, it'll actually show up literally in your present code. They will tell you this has been changed. Exactly.
So you change something. If I go back 3 months and try to change a transaction to say that actually Bernard gave me 28 Bitcoins to make me rich, right? I changed that, but it actually throws out the little hash codes that were put onto the pages. It throws them out, not just the one on that page, but the ones on the chain all the way to now.
Yikes.
So all of them go out, if you know what I mean. And so everyone can tell that something's been changed. You can see it straight away. And secondly, none of the other chains would have that change in them. Okay. So what happens is the systems are built they'll reheal themselves, if you mean. In other words, they'll discard that chain, they'll reject yours as being changed, and it'll continue with the one that they believe is true.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. That's
let me ask you a question. Because one, a good explanation too. We got a good grasp of why the internet was created, or at least how it spread out to the world. And when this guy came along then and connected us all, well, how would you describe the blockchain, or is it still too early to explain it as easy as we now can explain the internet?
Yeah, well, it's only developing now, so we're not sure where it's going, but we've enough time from the 10 years in 2009 after the crash, the economic crash. So the first thing they used, when your man, nobody knows who he is. It's Satoshi, what's his name? I can't remember his name.
Yeah, I think, I could come remember his name also.
That's one of them blanks. But anyway, he's anonymous and he releases that, and that's fine. So we have that idea there, like we said, about how it works. And initially it's used literally like a ledger, just for money, just for a thing called Bitcoin and just for transactions, and everyone's using it like that, and that's grand. That spreads very rapidly. Then you have a second level where people go, hang on a second, if it's a computer, then it's not just like a book. You don't have to just have ledger. You don't have to just have entries of like X amount of coins going over there and over here. You can actually put little programs on that, if you know what I mean. Like you could have, instead of a transaction, you could actually write in little bits of code that do things, if you know what I mean.
Give me an example if you can.
So instead of on the page, instead of saying like 200 Bitcoins moved from Bernard to Dylan's account, you could have put in a little piece of code onto the page and say, on the 28th of January 2022, move 28 Bitcoins from Bernard to Dylan, if you know what I mean. Now, don't, not yet, but you can put it into the chain. And
you can schedule it.
Yeah, and because it's code and because it's computers you're dealing with, they'll understand that and do it. You see? So someone went, hang on a second, we can put programs on here and they'll be on the chain. You see?
Yeah. Okay.
Right. So
I'm saying yeah, but I won't lie to you. I'm still struggling to process some of it.
Yeah. Okay. So that's the thing. So like the first thing is issuing it's a ledger, and the basic point we've got there is that it makes it that information is very difficult to change and can be relied on the internet. And the second thing is the chains are very difficult to corrupt, as we just
This seems to be something that almost overrides all other known systems, contracts, treaties, in terms of keeping your word, keeping it original, not changing it, not chopping it, and you lock it into this code. It's a bit like escrow in some ways, is it?
Yeah, so to stick with that idea that we were talking about, that it can't be corrupted because it's decentralized, it's very difficult to corrupt it. But so of course this means that it's easy to move things around and have it reliable. So you can have an account that's recorded in a blockchain of your Bitcoins or in money, or you can actually have anything really that you can imagine you can put on a computer. You could put it onto a blockchain, and then you understand that it's very difficult for anyone to change that, as long as that chain is there. So that suddenly makes the internet, it's completely different to where I could just break into your computer and alter all the information on it. There's not much you can do about it. Okay.
Yeah.
Whereas imagine now with a blockchain's running, I could break into your computer, change all the information on your blockchain. But the next thing is, as soon as you connect to the other computers, it'll all be corrected again. Yeah.
That's brilliant. So that is another way of explaining the internet again. It's about it's not one target, not one code, not one place.
So exactly, we're back to the original.
Yeah.
We're back to the original internet. Okay, ideas of the original internet, exactly. Except now it's a more modern version, and we have these chains running and stuff like that. Okay. Now the mining, you hear about Bitcoin mining and all that, but that's actually just the calculating of those hash codes. That's all that is. So it's not mining at all, really. It's calculating those codes. Yeah.
Is the blockchains and metaverse, are they in any way healthy for the environment? Because we know some of the data centers use a lot of energy and water and so on and so forth.
Well, I think they can be. I think that it's not. I don't think it's that. I think they will be. I think it's not that. The original one, I don't think anyone knew what was going to happen or how big it was going to get. And the original one was based on this idea that in order to secure the chains, that it would be good to have the computers do lots of work on making those hash codes. Okay. So that would make it difficult, which would mean people would have to invest a lot of hardware, they'd invest a lot in the computers. They actually run the ledgers, they run the chains, but it would, by making it difficult, that makes the chain more secure. Okay, so that was the original idea. But that, of course, has backfired in the sense that there's so many people mining Bitcoins now that it's become an energy crisis. You know what I mean?
Oh,
Like,
yeah.
yeah, you got like a problem there, right? But that's not the only way of doing it. You don't have to do it that way. You can do it a different way. You can have it that people's put money down. It's like putting money down on something, you know, like if all of us put money into something, then we all have a stake in it, and that can ensure that we all have a stake in it being correct. Do you know what I mean? So they're moving to those kind of ones now, where it's not like they're not ever increasing amounts of power to create the hash codes. They drop that, and instead they have everyone put in a stake. Everyone on the network and whatever. I won't go into all that because it's a bit
it's okay. But
technical.
Just kind of we started off with history, and we talked about mentalities. We talked about the Gaelic culture and the poets and the coding. We talked about English colonial systems in operation today in Ireland.
Yeah.
So we're back to the mentalities. And
So
we're kind of like outside all of that, right? We're still seeing a battle of mentalities, because why would Facebook want to go into Metaverse and not have done it prior to this?
Yeah. So leaving aside the money, exactly what it allows is because the things are reliable, what it allows is a lot more than just money. It allows things like entire supply chains to be put on the chain, onto the ledgers, onto the blockchains. You know, you could follow like a piece of cheese as it gets made and all the way through the system, and it would have reliable information. You know what I mean? It allows because it's decentralized. It allows you to build decentralized things again, if you know what I mean, like on a global scale. So you could build a chat service or something that would be around the whole world, but wouldn't be any particular company running it. It would just be on the run from the blockchains, if you know what I mean, basically on the internet. So you can see
it's a bit like it's a cross between what we talk about the lost castles, and then we talk about the current stuff with the conflict with Irish travellers and settlementality in the States. Yes. And then we often talked about the Matrix, and the Matrix being a programmed reality, which I would argue Ireland is not much different from the Matrix. Now we got Metaverse. Where does this all end? What's the
okay? Well, the
Metaverse
is slightly different in the sense that that's looking ahead. That's not different, but it's based on this. Okay, so they're looking ahead a bit, and they're saying that when everything gets built on top of this kind of technology for this new internet, that it's going to allow people to have like those kind of virtual worlds where they're all walking around. Metaverse comes from a sci-fi book in 1992 called Snow Crash, where this guy, and I haven't read it properly, but it comes from that, and it was where everyone's kind of living in this virtual world. You know, you've seen it in many sci-fi, so it's where you're. Oh yeah.
I'd recommend people watch the movie The Guy, and it's Ryan Reynolds is in it, and basically he's part of a code that came to life in a computer game.
Oh yeah.
So basically, he starts rewriting his own code and changing and all this kind of stuff. But it's well worth watching, I think, because I love that kind of stuff.
It was Ready Player One. I don't know, was that one of them? I haven't seen that either. But anyway, so the Metaverse is just looking into the future, where it's like everybody has virtual. You go to meetings which are in a virtual, virtual reality. That's essentially it, right? So they're looking a bit ahead. But the word Metaverse is coming from the people creating all these blockchains at the moment. Okay. Now, the first thing that's being disrupted, as we said, is finance and that, but it's going to go a lot further than that, obviously, in the future. But of course, the reason me and you were talking about it is that recently, like you pointed out, the internet had become this thing where very highly centralized on just a few big, massive companies like Amazon, Google, Facebook, and
that's right, yeah,
and a handful of others. And that wasn't really that wasn't intended from the point of view that it has problems for people's freedom, personal information, the way that all our information was taken and used either for political reasons or mostly
constantly for profits and power.
For profits and commercial reasons. And it's like you sign up to Facebook, fine, but they're selling you, the way they're making millions selling your money to selling your information, to advertisers.
You're on Facebook ranting and giving out and stinking the place up with your opinions, and somebody else is just milking you for all you're worth.
Yeah, exactly.
They've already have you hooked into their system. You've already given them your personal information. Wow.
Yeah, and of course that's going to get worse because as we more and more devices, this Internet of Things. You've got phones, everything gets intelligent, your fridges and everything knows something about you. Your fridge knows what your fridge knows what you're buying, your front door knows when you're coming in and out of the house, your Amazon Alexa knows when you're what kind of stuff you're looking at on Amazon. And then, you're getting all this, that kind of way that people get freaked out.
Do you think it will affect the physical world? Say, like, again, this is just kind of an example, but take all these big corporate colonial giants that never stopped. They influence the physical world. They actually pretty much buy politicians and governments left, right, and center. Will Metaverse come up with their own political system, a Metaverse political government?
So here's the same battle that we were talking about that was going on between the pale centralized system in Ireland on the one side and the decentralized Gaelic system on the other. We would say, me and you would say as well, we would say that same battle is still going on, in the sense of that sort of struggle for who's going to dominate that this new internet, because Facebook didn't change their name lightly, if you know what I mean. They changed their name very quickly, and he wants to hire 10,000 people to create this metaverse, but really it's in response to what they perceive as a threat to them being the one big social network system. Because actually, with these new blockchain systems, you can actually build a social network that has no company in charge, because it's decentralized, more like all the TUAs were in Ireland,
And so something happening like that. Sorry for the question, my friend. Didn't something happen like that with the banking systems and, say, the post office and the credit unions? They crippled them with regulations, so they couldn't get threat to them.
Absolutely, credit unions and things like that would have been an earlier form of, there were cooperatives and things like that. So you could say there were more decentralized systems as well, but they weren't for profit. They weren't like for profit only and that kind of stuff. So that's slightly different. But it's I mean, you can build anything on the blockchains, including for profit. So there's no reason why, when someone builds this new internet, that it doesn't, as Facebook realizes, if they can capture it quickly, and the same with other businesses, then before people realize, then they can dominate that world as well.
They have it in a way which is very, very Western, I would imagine, is that say ABC, you got the mobile phones, you got the internet, and you got Metaverse, and they're always kind of almost encouraging you that we're moving to a new place. We're coming from the old internet to the new internet, and now we're going to phase 3. But as you said earlier on, for us, because we're kind of a grasp on the mentalities and the history, it's like sitting outside of that and almost enjoying it at times, because you do see these battles over and back between the colonial companies in the physical world, and clash the mentalities between techies and politicians. It's just amazing, most of it, for me anyway.
So for a lot of the people realized, and it re-emerged again recently with these things called DAOs, which was a new type of company, as they thought it was a new type of company. Me and you were going to say it isn't, but
say it again, my friend?
So they call them a decentralized autonomous organization, or corporation. An organization, I'm just reading on the Wikipedia here, okay? So, and you'd find this interesting. An organization represented by rules encoded as a computer program that are transparent, controlled by organization members, and not influenced by a central government. So DAO's financial transaction record and program rules are maintained on a blockchain. The precise legal status of this type of business is unclear at the moment.
I remember in 2007, right, because for where I was coming from, I guess, the settled code was doing more damage to our people and themselves than anything else. So at the time, I applied to the Social Entrepreneurs of Ireland, which is brilliant people, and they had supported me. But unfortunately, I go into another time why it never maintained or last. But the idea at that time was, I thought that before we get to the settled courts, or before people end up going to jail because they didn't understand the laws and the laws didn't understand the people, that we would create our own system, our own get together, a training course, a module. I forgot what I was even calling it, because I didn't have fully developed concepts of our history at the time. But I knew it would need to happen. So I was willing to recreate this kind of platform where we talk to travelers, go through the issues, talk about what's ahead of them, talk about what kind of court they're facing, and also to just understand their own history and use that to benefit mental health. So that's where we're kind of at now at the moment with the modern setup with
Oh,
the
brilliant, brilliant. Yeah,
new
because
systems.
I think it represents opportunity. That's the thing, isn't it? In amongst that, they call like there's opportunity. I think if people have an awareness of what's going on, if you know what I mean. So it's not really just about coins. Obviously, loads of people are scrambling because they can make money on coins and
Oh, for me, Dylan, this is nothing more than mentality. You can call it anything they want, whether it be imperialism, colonization, capitalism, metaverse. It's still it's a battle of mentalities, and it's that's why I see it anyway.
Yeah, so you like this one because this is very similar to what we've got a word here for what you described earlier, where the poets had the codes in Ireland, right? So we had a decentralized system. So we have very important information in Ireland.
Knowledge, absolutely. I agree.
Very important information, because we actually understand what systems like that would run like and what they would actually work like, and that they could work and did used to work, and we're actually quite resistant. We're able to resist change, and we're actually good at distributing.
But I won't lie to you either, my friend. I get quite a kick out of this now, because this is something that was back in 2007 when I was doing that. I can go back another few years and say I was doing very similar things about countering the centralized mentality against what should have been a more decentralized mentality. It's just absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of, in a way, it's not that surprising. In a way, I mean, it's obviously fair play to yourself, but it kind of makes sense as well, doesn't it?
Yeah. Well, I suppose the reason I'm saying it is it's like it sounds and looks so familiar, even if we've never met it before.
Yeah.
We've countered this before, but also the fact that TraVision was already operating and trying to create something that was different from the Anglicized systems or the Western systems, that was based on decentralization and about giving the people and the clans and the communities more influence and power.
So I've actually seen things where they actually say that because, and this makes sense too. I've actually seen things where they're saying that it's being adopted in the East quicker. Some of the
Well, it makes sense, because they're outside the Western mentality.
Exactly, and that the West is having problems with some of the decentralized.
I'm sorry for laughing. I'll tell you why. It is funny for me, because remember a while back we were talking about mentalities a couple of years back.
Yeah.
And it was kind of the early stages of me trying to explain the settled mentality and the travel mentality. Not that I was explaining in great detail like we're doing now, but we're willing to explore it and try to understand it more. And we're learning at the same time. But you went on to check the theory of this mentality thing, that if I could be anywhere right at all, it would mean there should be a decline in the settled mentality. And you Google up and pull up some report that's 20 years in the makings. They were talking about the indigenous businesses were declining, and one of the key factors was the lack of creativity. Of course, creativity is your mentality.
Yeah.
So yes.
Yeah, which was to do with and to do with access to whether you have access to exactly. The mentality would mean that you would be blocked from access to your own history. In our case, it would mean that because your own history is in a different mentality to you know what we're saying.
I do. It's like if the world is swinging around, almost 360 and coming back to where a lot of the original ideas had once started in the Gaelic culture.
That's it. So I mean, exactly. I mean, that's where Ireland has it. We could have an advantage. We could actually have an advantage by being able to switch mentality to understand how to operate things that are decentralized. Do you know what I mean?
I'm not going to lie to you either and bullshit you. Earlier on, I mentioned I mentioned earlier on about the political metaverse. And a part of this voting system I wanted to part for TraVision, even before hearing of Metaverse, was very similar to what we're even talking about, codes and all this kind of stuff. And why wouldn't it be familiar? It comes from a particular kind of mindset.
Yeah.
But I was hoping that, I am not hoping, is to link up with the right kind of people, to develop an app on politics, travel politics, and could spread much further in wider communities, of course. But there's different levels to it. There's different voters' rights. And because all these are different features. But I was then looking at the Metaverse version, and I'm saying this is the exact same thing. So I'm looking, sorry, I was a bit of a rant. I was just thinking the earlier on, I mentioned the politics. It was actually a reason, because I've written down a lot of shit last night on a decentralized political system.
Yeah,
I can see Metaverse ending up electing and selecting individuals in the real world and governments if it's done correctly.
Well, so to make it work here in Western world where we are, I mean, it's going to take two things. You need actually two things, and we could have an advantage here from discussing what you're talking about. You know what I mean? In the sense that if you have any tradition at all of a mentality that can actually handle that and understand that to some extent, or just operates in that way, you know what I mean? That's normal, that's part of your mentality or your culture, and you're comfortable with that, you know what I mean? And you're not getting freaked out because it's not centralized, you know what I mean? Then you have an advantage. You should in theory have an advantage if you can, if you're having awareness, to build on those systems that are there that allow that. Like in Asia, for example, in certain parts of Asia, I'm not saying they're all, I mean, they have, China's very centralized in it some ways, but in other ways, their mentality allows them to actually adopt kind of collective decentralization much easier than in the West because of the history.
India would have very similar. Japan would have very similar also.
Yeah, and they're going for hell for leather on that. There's a big adoption in those places for that very reason. Now, it's interesting, and that's what I'm saying. Yeah, we could do that here, and I think it's really fascinating because I think we could write down that thing you like what you were saying earlier, which interests me. That we could say that medieval as a rough example, and I know we're sort of. We're not trying to say like we know exactly exactly what medieval Ireland was like. That's open for discussion, but for the purposes of this thing, we're talking about a decentralized system with numerous little territories all running independently, independent authorities, but they're all maintaining. They all have a code between them, which we know as Fennicus.
Just saw that, right? Yeah,
the law system, which was universal.
The medieval systems, right? And you're talking about the decentralization. And again, this is right to this present day because I grew up literally seeing this happening with clans, with communities, with families. So they have that decentralization mentality. It just needs a bit of tweaking, I think. Go on, sorry.
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying is that just even historical, sort of like that kind of, I'm wearing a history hat, but it's like when you're looking at it, you're kind of going, okay, so we have this system, and if that's the case, that's a way of understanding it for me anyway. So we're looking at it going, okay, so, but they have a universal code across the whole country. What makes it the Gaelic world? What unites the mentality? What makes it that you can walk from one end of the country to the other and actually off into Scotland if you want? And it's all the one zone in a way, even though you're going through numerous territories, You know
what it creates, Dylan, I think, because when you think about it, cultures are based on mentalities, and mentalities are based on cultures.
Yeah.
Is that when you grew up there, because you were saying about how would people know, again, travelers that I've never met, never seen, never even heard of their names, but yet we know we're travelers. We know there's a certain code. It's in a certain environment that you'll know if there's something off or something isn't right. It's a bit like reading your situation or your environment, which is very similar to reading the code. It's a bit like if something is off, you're going to sense it, you're going to feel it.
That's
it. If it's an immediate danger or threat, you'll also sense it. Fascinating stuff.
Yeah, so I'm going to say that actually what's interesting me here is that I see that written beside that DAO thing is that that we were saying that the autonomous decentralized corporation that they're having trouble dealing with in the West because the laws and stuff don't allow that to exist, if you know what I mean. And that's one of the things that we might be missing in Ireland because it never got to develop. It was never, the law was very heavily centralized the other way. And interestingly, because of the way Irish history went, I would say, we actually are more centralized than even the countries in Europe that were based on a very centralized system, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
When the kings conquered their own countries like France and England and made them very centralized, they're actually less so now, but we're the most centralized in Western Europe. Anyway. But we won't go on about it. But I'd say here, there's a word here that I didn't even know, which is algocracy. Okay, and it means government by the algorithm.
Oh my God! Yeah, well, yeah.
As an alternative form of government or social ordering. Now, for some people, that could be a nightmare because they'll be thinking, Jesus, But it's the usage of in this case, it's computer algorithms. So it's like saying we have codes or laws, no different to law codes, which would be an early form of the same thing in a way. So here's the law, here's the rules, here's what happens. But Ireland is that one where actually the algorithm was higher than the political system, if you know what I mean, in the sense that the algorithm was across the whole of the Gaelic world, as in the Brehon law was across the whole Gaelic world, and it was unified. but the political system was completely decentralized.
Yes, yes,
You know what I
yes.
mean? So it's completely different way of thinking, isn't it? From my perspective to the Western way of thinking, where it's the other way around. You know, everything is subject to the state. Everything must be subject to the state. The state is only one thing. There can only ever be one state. Whereas in the Gaelic world, there was numerous states, but all were subject to the law.
That's right. Well, again, you go back into the mentality thing, right? You got Christianity, which is one mentality, but within that, you had 33,000 different dominions, like all the different groups.
But do you remember what we were describing? That the law is not administered by a central authority. There isn't a central authority in Gaelic Ireland saying this is what Brown law is and this is what enforces it. It's enforced by everybody, by everybody. It's by decentralized, like the decentralized blockchain. It's because each individual territory is saying this is what's the law. You know what I mean? And if numerous,
Go ahead.
Sorry,
in the English system, in the English system, Western system, when something goes out of place or the law's broke, it's a very strict system of guilty, not guilty, punishment, and they have a really huge focus on that. Where the Celtic culture, it was more about, the effects of it it'd be like punching yourself in the nose to break the law. You'd be actually literally just hurting yourself and nobody else. Rather than being punished and getting angry and not understanding it. Within a Celtic mentality or culture, I believe that it's more a case of that you're biting off your own foot.
Well, that's it. There was constant attempts in the Gaelic system of law seems to be mostly to do with rebalancing the system, if you know what I mean. In other words, when it's running, things are peaceful, but when it goes out of, wars break out when it gets out of balance. So they'd be normally spending a lot of the things was involved, not just punishment, as you said, the English law in Ireland, in Dublin area and in the cities, was concerned only about punishing infractions against the state. Okay, you did something wrong, the state punished you. It's a completely different concept, like you're describing in the Gaelic world, where things go out of balance and battle and fights happen, and of course there's crimes and things, but everything is dealt with quite differently, in the sense that it's actually it's done on a balanced system where good and bad, and in other words, good actions are rewarded as much as bad actions are punished, and they're actually balanced against each other. And actually in cases of crime, mitigating circumstances and things like that, where people did good thing, if they did it because they believed it was doing good, that kind of stuff, then it can be balanced out, if you know what I mean. Like it goes for you and against you, if you know what I mean. And
it's a bit like what Alan Watts would be talking about, concentration or focus or even standing points. You can look at any one thing in three different ways. Yeah. You can look at it from a standing point. You can go up real close to it and look at it, and it'll look different when you're closer to it. Or you can take a step away back from it and then it'll look different again. So the Gaelic structure was a bit like that, looking at all the different perspectives of one thing. Maybe. Well,
actually, we might talk about that. We talk about that in the future some other time, because I was going to say to you, it's intriguing to me. It's like there's an algorithm or a code, and the idea is that they're trying to interpret what it is that's right. You know what I mean? What is the code saying? You know what I mean? Like that's the point.
Remember, for years I've been shouting about the English language as a systematic language. It's a chopped up Frankenstein language, which of course I've changed a lot since then. But I always seen it pretty much as a coded language, always. And it has that coded effect on people. If you take the tier system, like if you take the working class people, these are not unintelligent people. These have just been people who've been denied a certain level of education, a certain coding that will get them on to the next level. And that's the way I always see it anyway.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, true. Yeah. That's
scared the shit of linguistics.
Yeah, that's another. Yeah, well, of course, the culture goes into the language. You can't separate them to some extent. I mean, you can a bit, but you can't. Yeah, of course, the concepts go into the are embedded into the language. So
I think Ireland's got the wrong blockchain. We've got the wrong code.
Well, exactly. We're kind of falling between two stools, because we're kind of using two and half of one and not understanding the one that was not understanding either of them properly. You know what I mean?
Do you think this will help people in terms of eliminating world hunger? challenging inequalities? Do you think Metaverse might have that potential, given that it's so locked in, or is it just really for trading and so on and so forth?
No, I think that a lot of social good can be done, because I think that, as you pointed out, a lot of things to do with ID. I think a lot of it I think interpreted correctly, as in used, if we see its potential and the people are educated about it, I think it can be used to do a lot of good. Yeah. I mean, you were discussing things to do with IDs. Like, for example, the state says that you cannot have this because you don't have a set address or something. Whereas, like, we were discussing that already. We were saying, well, you could have ID and voting rights and not have a set address if it was registered on the blockchains. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Believe it or not,
And it would actually allow movement.
In well, call it reality. We call it the real world, the physical world. Is, say, if you were a traveler living in a trailer, if you're a traveler homeless, if you're anyone that's homeless,
Yeah.
well, automatically you're not part of the code of the system.
Yeah.
So when you go to vote, you see you have no address, you have no code.
Yeah.
What we're saying with TraVision on this is that we'll create systems that gives homeless people a care of address where they can pick up their voting card, so they do have a right to vote. Bits like that, where I think we're doing that's similar to the Metaverse.
Well, exactly. I mean, if you're legal, why you say it's a house? That was all to do with having to have people pegged or settled into one place. You know what I mean? Pinned to one area or whatever. You know what I mean? Which was a concern. The
number of your house was your code.
Which was very much a concern of the state, if you know, of the unitary state. You know what I mean? Which was the main thing it was concerned about, not just in Ireland but in England and other places, was making sure nobody moved anywhere. You know. So
before we finish up, because this is going, just remember before there was a kind of a lazy jump from going one platform to another. Do you remember the digital, not the word digital, I beg your pardon, the cameras, Kodak, right? They were like the biggest camera industry in probably the world.
Yeah.
And then came along the internet, and everyone thought the internet, that's not real. Hand out a business card, word of mouth, use the papers. And then Kodak almost collapsed, where sprung up companies that did jump on early. Is that a bit like what's going to happen with Metaverse?
I think that's exactly what's happening. Yeah, I think it's the rise of the new stage of the internet. So yeah, there's that's a lot of what's going on with the cryptocurrency and everything. It's really just a rush to, like the .com bubble in the 90s. There's an element of a bubble to it, but it's actually based on real technology. The coins aren't even the important thing, although they're making people money. They're really just investing in building the blockchain technology, which a lot of stuff is going to be based on going into the future.
So because just before we finish up, right? And again, this is kind of
including hopefully TraVision.
I was going to pretty much say that that because our focus has always been on the mentalities. Like, we're not blaming people, we're not blaming genetics, we're not blaming anything, because when I say mentalities, I mean a language, I mean a code, I mean that kind of setup that people can step outside of it. And if people need help to step outside of it, just think of it in these terms. We are a people on an island that had thousands of years of culture in its own language. We now are operating in another language that came from somewhere else. That somewhere else had never left because we kept using the systems and the language and the mentality. We're saying that as people in the west of Ireland, there are Irish travellers who did not come from that coding and cannot adapt to it. So we, through TraVision, hopefully, it's going to sort of a decolonization that will give people a vast, better understanding of Metaverse, Facebook, mentalities, cultures, because it's all about stepping outside these codes, isn't it, my friend?
Yeah, that's it. Good sum up. Yeah.
I'm going to keep that now for my potential funders or investors.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, why not?
Dilean, thank you very much for the podcast. I really appreciate it. And we got to do one on the Matrix. We said we'd do it before the movies come out, because if find us doing it afterwards, so yeah. But anyway, do that as soon as possible.
Kind of covered some of it there, but yeah, I get you. Yeah, absolutely.
I think I'd like to break it down. From now on, I'm just going to be a bit more freer, because in the past I was all riled up. I've been in the firing line for all my life. I wasn't getting paid for it, so I didn't have other structures in my life that added to my behavior. So now I'm just trying to decentralize myself. Understand is that to invite people to understand is to invite them instead of trying to force it upon them. I'm saying this out loud at the same time, but this is some of the things I'm trying to work on myself.
Yeah.
So So
No,
what have you been
very
working on?
interesting. Thanks yourself. Very interesting conversation. Thanks for that. I have a few
Well,
ideas out of that. A few ideas out of that myself. I think I need to work.
that's brilliant, and I think that's the whole idea of it. Because as you said, there's an advantage here. I can sense it. It's a bit like going through something all your life, knowing something but not knowing it,
Yeah.
and then finding out, and it's like all the dominoes are starting to fall. And it isn't one of these elaborate confirmation biased. Of course, I want a lot of things to be real, to challenge the things in our life that are pretty much unreal. But we also have it from your own perspective as an historian. You can see when there's a mentality shift. You can see how the systems pump that mentality over centuries.
I mean, even if it was
So,
as simple as knowing that it once was, things have not always been the same. You know what I mean? So
yeah,
that's important to know that. You know what I mean?
and you don't need no high levels of education. I left when I was 13. I didn't go back. I have no qualifications, which might explain why I'm still unemployed. But it in terms of mentalities and systematic mentalities and all this stuff,
You're not doing me any favors.
No, but I say here's the advantage is that if you grew up in an environment or born into an environment, there's no reason you'd ever second guess it that it wasn't normal.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I get you.
So you have already had that kind of a Sligo-based sense of the world. In other words, you knew what the pain was, you knew what the English was, you knew what the mentalities was to a certain degree. And the more and more you understand that, you see these things we're talking about now. I mean, I wouldn't have come near these things a few years ago because I wouldn't have understood anything. I don't still understand it, but what I do understand, it belongs into a particular mentality that's been raging on for centuries, and that I do know about.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you very much, my friend, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks.
All right, look after yourself. Bye-bye.